So Advent. So we are going to be thinking a little bit about this morning about waiting. And I wonder, when I say the word to wait or waiting, what kind of mental pictures, memories, associations that word waiting generates. You know, is it about waiting for the results from something? You know, maybe it's waiting in a difficult way, waiting for medical test results, waiting to find out the outcome of an interview. I've got one on Tuesday, so I will be feeling that this week, or an exam, or maybe it's waiting for something exciting. I know some of my children are already like, why isn't Christmas here now? I'm not sure I can wait for a month until I see my cousins and I have Christmas presents. So maybe we're waiting for something exciting. We're looking forward to it. Anticipation is growing. Maybe it generates maybe some annoyance. I was stuck, as some of you may be over the last week or so, in a very, very long traffic jam trying to get into Oxford City Centre. Don't do it. It's a bad place to be. I was stuck for an hour or more trying to get in, and very late for something. So yeah, maybe it's that kind of frustrating, irritating waiting. Yeah, the word waiting can generate a lot of different feelings, emotions, and memories, I think, for us. Anxiety, maybe sometimes, frustration, irritation, maybe anger, and maybe some degree of excitement as well. But it often feels, certainly in my experience, that waiting can be a bit uncomfortable, and that our culture largely tries to avoid it altogether. All that buying stuff now and paying for it later, or time-saving devices that we seem to be rather obsessed with. However, waiting, it appears in the natural world, is hardwired into the way God's creation works, into even our biology. It takes time for good things to grow. And it's inevitable. Life is full of periods of waiting. And I just wonder, and that's what we'll be thinking about this morning, whether we can actually learn and practice embracing those seasons of waiting. Maybe there might be some treasure for us to find in those times. And as I've already said, today is the first Sunday of Advent. Advent is from a Latin word, which is adventus, and that means literally the coming. We are in a month-long period of waiting for the coming. And throughout the centuries since Jesus was born, Christians have marked this period of time, using it as an opportunity to practice waiting well. And in Advent, the waiting is twofold. So we're waiting for something that happened a long time ago, Jesus' birth, and we celebrate that on the 25th of December. But we're also waiting for something yet to come. The Bible says that one day Jesus will return. And that will signal the end of things as they are normal, as they are now. And at that time, brokenness will become perfect. Ugliness will be turned into beauty. There will be no more suffering. Anything that is being opposed to God's way of doing things will be stripped away. And all of his creatures will have the opportunity to live in loving peace with him, with each other, and with the natural world around us. So we are people of these in-between times. The kingdom is here, in part. That happened when Jesus came. He said, the kingdom of God is here. But it doesn't take a rocket scientist to look around us and know that the kingdom of God is not here fully. There is a lot of brokenness in our world. And we're going to turn to a passage of the Bible this morning that is associated with the Christmas story, but not the most famous bit. It's not actually about the birth of Jesus. It's a little bit after that, about a month or so after Jesus was born. And I'm going to read it to you. And it is Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 40. So if you want to follow along, if you have a physical Bible or want to follow along on a Bible on your phone, then please do. Luke chapter 2, verses 22 to 40. And my Bible says what's it called? The heading. I was going to say the headline. The heading is Jesus presented in the temple. When the time came for the purification rites required by the law of Moses, Joseph and Mary took Jesus to Jerusalem to present him to the Lord. As it is written in the law of the Lord, every firstborn male is to be consecrated to the Lord and to offer a sacrifice, in keeping with what is said in the law of the Lord, a pair of doves or 2 young pigeons. Now, there was a man in Jerusalem called Simeon who was righteous and devout. He was waiting for the consolation of Israel, and the Holy Spirit was on him. It had been revealed to him by the Holy Spirit that he would not die before he had seen the Lord's Messiah. Moved by the Spirit, he went into the temple courts. When the parents brought in the child Jesus to do for him what the custom of the law required, Simeon took him in his arms and praised God, saying, "Sovereign Lord, as you have promised, you may now dismiss your servant in peace, for my eyes have seen your salvation, which you have prepared in the sight of all nations, a light for revelation to the Gentiles," that's the non-Jews, "and the glory of your people Israel." The child's father and mother marveled at what was said about him. Then Simeon blessed them and said to Mary, his mother, "This child is destined to cause the falling and rising of many in Israel, and to be a sign that will be spoken against, so that the thoughts of many hearts will be revealed, and a sword will pierce your own soul too." There was also a prophet, Anna, the daughter of Phanuel of the tribe of Asher. She was very old. She had lived with her husband 7 years after their marriage, and then was a widow until she was 84. She never left the temple, but worshipped night and day, fasting and praying. Coming up to them at that very moment, she gave thanks to God and spoke about the child to all who were looking forward to the redemption of Jerusalem. When Joseph and Mary had done everything required by the law of the Lord, they returned to Galilee, to their own town of Nazareth. And the child grew and became strong. He was filled with wisdom, and the grace of God was on him. This is a story that's full of waiting. So Mary is required by Jewish law to wait for 33 days after giving birth before she's actually even able to leave her house. And then at that point, she's required to go to the temple in Jerusalem to be purified. And as she's just had her firstborn son, she's also to make a sacrifice, giving thanks to God for him and to dedicate him to the Lord. So that's why this little family is there. And they meet a man, Simeon. And we're told that he has been waiting for something. We don't know how long, but he's been waiting. God has told him that before he dies, he will see the rescuer, the Messiah that the people of God have been waiting for. And the Holy Spirit somehow, on that particular day, at that moment, has prompted Simeon to go to the temple. And he sees this tiny newborn baby, and he knows immediately who he is. And he erupts with praise and thanksgiving and prophetic insight about Jesus, explaining that Jesus will be the Messiah, the rescuer for both Israel, God's chosen people, the fulfillment of all that they have been waiting for hundreds of years, and also that this Messiah will also be for non-Jews, a light and a rescuer for them as well. Jesus will be a freedom bringer, but he is also one who will cause deep, deep division. Some, like Simeon, are going to recognize him for who he is and respond with worship, whereas others, it will be their downfall. And if you read on in Luke and the other Gospels, you come to find out who those are who really detest Jesus, and they're often the religious leaders of the time. And then Simeon also speaks to Mary, and he prophesies about the pain that she is going to experience. And we know, if we read on, that that comes to be true, that she has the most excruciating experience of seeing her own son treated appallingly, even put to death on a cross. And then there's another person who's also been waiting for God to rescue his people, Anna. We're told something about how old she is. She's a really old lady. She's late 80s, maybe even slightly older. And ever since her husband's early death, she has been worshipping and praising and praying to God in the temple every day. She's like a modern day nun or monk. And we really don't know much about her or what fruit she may or may not have seen from these daily prayers. But just like Simeon, when she sees this baby, she recognizes him for who he is. And her response, like his, is one of overwhelming joy and excitement. She couldn't contain herself, but speak to anyone. I imagine she's just like gabbering away in the temple. Anyone who will listen, she wants to tell them about this baby and who he will be, how he will be a freedom bringer. And this story is sent against a backdrop of waiting. The whole of God's people, Israel, waiting. And there's been a 400-year period of waiting. And in different church traditions, it's called different things. In some traditions, it's called the deuterocanonical period, or the intertestamental period. Protestants also often refer to this 400 years as a long period of silence. And that is because there's been no prophecy. Nobody has heard from God, been sent by God to speak to his people. There's been no new information since Malachi, the last prophet of the Old Testament. And in that last book, Malachi, in chapter 4, encourages God's people to remember the law of Moses. And he promises that God will one day send an Elijah, a prophet like Elijah, to Israel before the day of the Lord, meaning the end of time. And despite this silence from God, it's been a busy period for the Jewish people. There's been various takeovers by a number of very powerful nations. Now they're living under Roman occupation. And actually, to some extent, they had heeded Malachi's advice to remember God's law, the Torah, and avoid another period of exile as they'd experienced before. And various Torah, law-abiding groups had developed that we read about in the New Testament. So if you read about the Sadducees and the Pharisees, there are other groups as well. But these were people who'd become very committed to following the detail of God's law. And this period of time enters a little bit before the story that we've just read, before the birth of Jesus, with the entry of John the Baptist, who dressed and behaved and lived much like the Old Testament prophet Elijah. And he told people to prepare the way for the coming Lord. And it just struck me as I was thinking about this, actually, how amazing that must have been to have a prophet after 400 years. No wonder there was a lot of excitement, and John the Baptist had attracted a large following when people hadn't heard God's voice for such a long time. And that coming Lord that John spoke about was this baby Jesus, the Messiah, in the temple that day. However, he was not going to be the kind of Messiah that many Jews imagined or even hoped he was going to be. He was going to overthrow spiritual oppression, Satan's ways, rather than physical oppressive forces such as the Romans. So just a bit of context of the story that was just read. And in thinking about this story, I was just struck by how actually this story might tell us and show us how we might wait well, both in this period of Advent, but in other periods of time when we are inevitably going to have to wait. And some of these are going to come up on the stream. But firstly, I think it's important that we acknowledge that we have a choice about how we wait. We can either wait with hopeful expectancy, or we can wait feeling anxious, frustrated, wound up, cross, all those kind of things. As we've already mentioned, Advent means coming. And Simeon and Anna and the Bible as a whole makes it clear that we are waiting for this coming. Jesus has come, but he will come again. He will rescue all of his creatures and make everything new. And we can either choose to accept that God has come to us in Jesus and will come again one day, and therefore be filled with hopeful expectation, as Craig was mentioning earlier, that actually this world is not all that there is, that the pain and brutality that we experience in our own lives, that we witness in the lives of other people, is going to end one day. And it is very poignant at this time of the year that the place where Jesus walked the earth, where the Israelite people had called home, is now a place of enormous suffering in Gaza and Palestine and Israel at the moment. But we can choose to believe that actually one day that will all be swept away. And whatever the circumstances of our lives, we can choose to be expectant that God will one day have the final word. God, the only fully loving, patient, faithful, generous being there is, will put all things right. I like the way that Eugene Peterson in the story speaks about Simeon. He says that he had lived in prayerful expectancy of help for Israel, God's people. And it's maybe a bit like pregnancy. Some of us may have experienced that. Others of us will never experience that. And obviously, when we're thinking about Advent, we're thinking about Mary being pregnant and then giving birth to Jesus. And for a lot of pregnant women, certainly in this country, unless there is a real cause for concern about the health of the baby, which of course there sometimes is, pregnancy can be a wonderful time of anticipation and excitement. Parents to be making space in their houses, in their diaries, in their hearts and their minds for the coming of a child. And our waiting can be pregnant with this promise from God of new and abundant life. Do we allow times of waiting, whether we've chosen them or whether they are forced upon us, to develop in us patience, which is something the Bible talks about as a good fruit of the Holy Spirit working in us, but also to develop a yearning, like a longing for God and all that is good? If we are to live with this hopeful expectancy, how do we go about doing that? How do we develop that? It's difficult. Well, we can stay close to God, and that's the next point. In every season of life, when it's easy to do so, and also when it's hard, we can prioritize developing a vibrant inner life with God. And I think Anna is a beautiful example of that. Maybe we can't spend every day in God's house like she did, but that doesn't mean we can't develop something of that similar intimate walk that she knew with him. 80 years plus of doing that. Making that her highest priority, conversing in prayer, talking to God about herself, about other people, interceding for them, listening to God. Knowing him so well that she recognized his promptings and his movements. So when she sees Jesus, just like Simeon, she knows exactly who he is. We don't know much about her, and unlike Simeon, we don't know whether she ever believed that she herself would see God's rescue plan, the Messiah. But I imagine she would have continued, as she'd always done, praying and worshipping, regardless of whether this day had ever come. I imagine that she got to enjoy her time in God's presence too much to stop doing so. And actually seeing Jesus that day in the temple was like the icing on the cake of the many blessings that she'd already experienced through just spending time in God's presence. God's presence was enough for her. He was the central blessing. Thirdly, we're waiting in prayer for hopeful expectancy rather than waiting with anxiety or frustration or all of that. I think we can not only learn to just tolerate, to bear and grudge those periods of time, but maybe even to receive them as a gift. Waiting can produce beautiful fruit in our lives. It helps us develop the dependency and trust on God. There's loads of waiting in the Bible. What a famous example is the Israelites having to wait for at least a generation in the wilderness before they were allowed to enter the promised land. And what they did there was they learnt to depend on God for their daily bread, for manna and for quail. And it seems like the way it is with God is sometimes we need to get to the end of ourselves, to use up all of our own natural resources before God shows up. A bit further in the Gospel of Luke, you come to chapter Luke, you get to Luke chapter 8. And it seems that in that story that God waits until the wind blows and the storm rages before he intervenes. This is a story about Jesus' closest followers who are in a boat and a storm comes up. They're fishermen, so they're often in boats. Jesus is with them and he's gone to sleep. And the storm rages and he does not wake up. It strikes me that Jesus is remarkably relaxed to be able to sleep through an incredibly ferocious storm. But surely that's because he somehow knows that his Father God is in control. That kind of peace can be available even to us if we persist in seeking God. Richard Foster wrote that to be yoked, or to that just is another word for being close to God, following his ways, yoked to Jesus, all of our thrashing and our rushing begins to ebb away under the steady pace of the Master of life. Isn't that wonderful? All of our thrashing and rushing can ebb away as we just live under the steady pace of the Master of life, who knows how to do life better than any of us ever could. He is in control. He knows what we need. But waiting can hurt, and that's the next point. Pain can come sometimes as we're waiting, sometimes as we're longing for things, for good things, in the midst of difficulty. And this is absolutely appropriate as well. If you read on a bit in the New Testament, come to Romans, the letter to the Romans written by Paul, chapter 8, verse 22, Paul writes that the whole of creation, all of the natural world, even the plants and the animals and the birds, and certainly us humans, are groaning together in the pains of childbirth until now. Birthing can involve, well, it does certainly involve pain, I know. And as something is being birthed, there is pain. And often that's our self that we've developed, actually our false self being stripped away. But that can be a difficult, painful process. God taking away that false self and actually giving us something far more beautiful, which is our true self, our true identity as his child, where we become dependent on him and we live in that life that Richard Foster was just talking about. And living in these in-between times, between the now of the kingdom of God and the not yet, the kingdom of God not being here in full, can be painful. And we can feel that, rightly so. And it should hurt us when evil seems to be running rampant in the world, when people hurt one another, when there's disease and sickness and many other things. And it's also painful when we're longing for something good and it isn't happening. Maybe we've prayed for something for many years and we still aren't seeing the fruit. People don't always recover from disease. Of course they don't. People die. Not everyone who longs and wants to get married or wants to have children or longs to have their dream job ever gets to enjoy those things. And there can be some seasons of our lives which are particularly painful. There are many wise people, fortunately, that have gone before us, if we are followers of Jesus, who can offer us much wisdom on this. And someone called St. John of the Cross, who was a 16th century Spanish spiritual leader, wrote about something called the dark night of the soul. And this is an experience that is well known by many Christians. And actually, although it can be about painful circumstances, he was chiefly referring to actually times in life when God feels really distant, when we don't hear from God, and how painful that can be. And for those of us that were at the Vineyard Young Adults Conference a few weeks ago called Cause to Live For, Steve Nicholson, he was one of the speakers there, actually spoke. He didn't call it a dark night of the soul, but it sounded very much like one for him. He was in his 60s at the time. He's now probably late 60s, early 70s. And he had been leading churches for years and years. He was very well used to hearing God speak very intimately to him and to him on behalf of others. And for no reason that he could determine, suddenly for 3 years he didn't hear God at all. God went completely quiet. And he didn't really speak much about how that felt. I imagine that was very disconcerting, maybe quite concerning, painful, I imagine. But in that period, he carried on. He carried on leading his church, and he just carried on being faithful, doing what he'd always done, praying, worshipping, leading other people, reading God's word. And I imagine that time for Steve was really productive, although he didn't speak about exactly what fruit that had produced. But St. John of the Cross talks about how those dark nights of the souls can be purifying to the soul. They can be times when we are drawn in closer to God, maybe in our desperation. I heard Pete Greig speak recently on a podcast. He was talking about unanswered prayer. And he said, during these times when we've been praying for stuff and we don't see the answers and it's painful and it's difficult and it's confusing and all of that, we can either ask two questions. We can either ask God why, or we can ask a different kind of question. We can ask, where are you, God? Or what are you doing? And then finally, last point, when hope is realised, and sometimes we get those joyful moments in our life when prayers do get answered, and if we know Jesus one day, we will have the greatest of joy when we get to meet him face to face, and this life is just like a mere pale representation of everything that we can enjoy one day in the fullness of life with him. Then how are we going to respond? Anna and Simeon's response is beautiful. They erupted into praise and thanksgiving. Such was their joy. I wonder when actually God does answer, how we respond. Do we just kind of gloss over it and move on to the next thing? because we're too busy maybe to really pay attention to that small detail that he has graciously attended to? Or are we grateful? Do we pause? Do we praise? Are we joyful? And just to finish, it seems that Advent is an invitation to practice waiting. Waiting with God, developing prayerful, hopeful expectation of great goodness and joy to come. And in doing so, that actually we realise that we don't need to force things, that we are offered deep rest in him as we wait. All this waiting can feel very confusing, can feel very difficult, can feel very strange. It can even feel painful. But actually, if we press into God, we can know that ultimately he has us, and I think Randy used this phrase at the beginning, he has us in the palm of his hand, and that at least one day he will make all things new and good. So let's just be quiet. Let's just wait for these moments. Let's just see what God might want to say to us and how he might want us to respond. Lord, would you teach us how to wait? And maybe actually we're not waiting for anything in particular at the moment. But actually Advent is still a time to practice waiting for Christmas, and to practice developing a longing and a yearning, but a patience for your kingdom to come more fully. Or maybe actually we are waiting. We know exactly what we're waiting for, and it's painful and it's difficult, and we're not sure when this period is going to end. And Father, I pray for all of us that are in those moments of waiting and it's deeply uncomfortable, would you come and draw alongside us? Would you help turn our questions of, why God, why aren't you doing this? That thrashing around, that striving, into letting the Master of life lead the way. Allowing him to quieten the storm. Allowing him to give us himself, like Anna had experienced day after day after day. Of enjoying being present with him and you, Lord, with us. And I just sense that actually for some of us that's never really, maybe we've known it in our head, but it's never really kind of sunk in that actually stress doesn't have to be part of the deal. That of course we all get anxious sometimes and worried or agitated, but actually stress, certainly at a kind of really regular level, doesn't need to be part of what we just have to put up with in this life. And maybe for those of us that, if there is anyone like that who feels like that there's just almost something that we need to do in our minds and hearts, that we almost need to do an exchange. Even if we're not fully sure that we believe it to be true. Maybe we just think we're just that kind of stressed out, kind of intense, or what, I don't know, whatever kind of personality, or we've just lived with that for so long we can't imagine it being different. But even if our faith is low for that changing, I just encourage you, if that is you, just to offer that, just to say, this is what it is. I don't want it anymore. I just give that over to you. And Lord, would you come in and would you just flood our hearts and our minds with deep peace. And I sense as well that just for us to be aware this week of where God might want us to be a blessing to someone else who actually might be waiting. And that just to be alert to, like Anna and Simeon were, to the movings of your Holy Spirit. Where actually we might just have a timely word for someone who's in pain, who's experiencing frustration or unanswered prayer or whatever it might be. Yeah. As we finish this morning, just pray for each of us that wants to. Would we start to practice that art of asking, where are you moving, Lord? What are you doing? In the very small things as well as in the much larger things. Amen. Wow.